Shall we get going then?
Let's start.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much for having me in your Varonis offices today.
No problem. It's nice to see you in the flesh.
I know, we've probably been working together for like 2 years and haven't actually met in the flesh before.
Amazing.
Yeah. Am I, as you imagined,
Absolutely.
all in
taller. Everyone's taller.
Yes, indeed. Or shorter, from my case.
Yeah, no, well, I guess so, yeah. Just amazing how that you cannot establish height, can you?
No.
On Zoom.
No.
And I've met some people and they walk into the office and they're towering. And I'm like, oh my God, you must have a low chair.
Yeah, so, you just have no idea, do you? No, but it's really nice to meet you.
And you.
And what we decided to talk about today is zero-day vulnerabilities, because we've had a few recently, like Log4j. What to do about them? What should a CISO do to protect themselves, and what should they expect from their vendors like Varonis and their partners like Somerford?
Yes, sure. So what a difficult job. I mean, how do you possibly, but I think, Donald Rumsfeld summed it all up, isn't it? There are known knowns, there are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. And nothing rings truer in the world of cybersecurity, I suppose.
Yeah.
So how do you possibly deal with something that nobody knows anything about?
Yeah.
It's hard.
Because these are the zero-day vulnerabilities, I'm sure people know who are listening, are ones that are kind of embedded into the protocols and quite low-level things that people build on to make their apps. Right?
Yeah, well, a zero-day could be anything, really. It could be just something that, I mean, the very definition of a zero-day is nobody is aware of a vulnerability that exists in a particular system. Any new piece of malware that's created, and of course the new pieces of malware are created probably hourly nowadays, every single one of those is a zero-day until something detects it, something becomes aware of it, and then
it's day one and it's ticking.
Yeah, but it sort of stops being a zero-day once we have a mechanism to detect it and mitigate it and stop it. Yeah. But up to that point, we are dealing with the unknowns. So going back to your question, how does an organization deal with zero-day vulnerabilities? Really, it comes down to visibility. I mean, if we're to stand any chance of identifying something that is abnormal, we need to have eyes on anything that's important, anything that's going to give us some sort of indicator that something has gone in a direction that isn't typical patterns of behaviour that we would expect. Yeah. And there's lots of examples, and we'll cover Log4j, and obviously there was the Exchange one that came out last year, and then obviously SolarWinds, which was it was a supply chain zero-day vulnerability that nobody had any idea that was going to happen. So there's lots of examples over the years.
And are they coming thick and fast? Are they coming more and more often?
I think they tend to go in waves, really. I mean, it is the holy grail of any type of attack. Yeah. If you can identify a vulnerability and then exploit that vulnerability before anybody's even aware of it, obviously, inevitably, you have the upper hand. There's all sorts of arguments about whether we should publicize zero-day vulnerabilities that people have found. Once you publicize it, that we found this potential vulnerability. There was one in Exchange quite recently that we found in the Einstein ability to search in Salesforce.
Sorry, Varonis found it.
Yeah, we found it in Salesforce just a few months ago. But once you publicize this,
you let other people know about it.
Then obviously you're then open to be susceptible to being breached.
So it's tricky, isn't it? So the challenge is, firstly, how do you know that there is a vulnerability? Who alerts you? And then how do you deal with it when you are aware of it, or do you even publicize it?
Well, how do you know? Well, there are two ways of finding out. Either you've been a victim of it, or it's become in the public domain and you've been made aware of it. It's one of those things where there are day-to-day operational tasks, and I'm teaching people to suck eggs now, that we need to be doing to ensure that we're in the best possible position to at least mitigate the potential risk or impact of what this could cause us. So, patching, it goes without saying. Even today, organizations are still behind the curve sometimes in patching. And they tend to overlook just the smallest, the Log4j is a vulnerability that the vulnerability that was discovered was called Log4 Shell, and it was something that typically existed within inside. Apache was quite common, but tend to be overlooked. So obviously patching, but what do we preach as a company? We talk about least privilege, we talk about 0 day, we talk about only ensuring the right people have access to the right data.
Zero trust, yeah.
Yeah, so, zero trust, not 0 day. So there are operational things that you should be doing, and that should never be taken for granted.
It's quite tricky to actually have pure good visibility of all your estate, right? If you're quite a large
well, really hard. I mean, and if you think about organisations that have built up, for example, maybe they've invested in a log aggregator or a SIM that is designed to collect logs to provide visibility, but as you've just outlined, it could be enormous, absolutely enormous amounts of information, and inevitably is. The larger organisations are receiving billions of events from logs every single day.
Yeah.
It's how you interpret that information and what you use that information for that is going to put you in good stead to be able to identify threats. So one of the things that I talk about a lot when I speak to organisations like this, and we have organisations come to us who have been the victims of 0 day and ask us how do we possibly protect against this stuff? Well, you need to be really, really, you need to think about what is the type of information we want to collect. And when we look at things like 0 day exploits, they are really just a stepping stone to get inside an organisation. It's a backdoor. It's a way in.
So you might not be able to see what the backdoor was, but then you can look at the behaviours of the accounts and then work out.
Well, that's it. You hit the nail on the head, exactly. Because the first thing you're going to want to do is then use that jump point to then go and run some reconnaissance. I mean, what is the end game here? Inevitably, the end game is going to be able to monetize your activity. How do you monetize activity? It's about data. Really, at the end of the day, data has value. All data has value to somebody.
So any attack wants to monetize the data.
Of course, yes. I mean, there are two types of attacks. There are the ones that want to take an organisation out, which is typically known as denial of services, and there are the ones that actually want to make some revenue out of it. And the way to make revenue, it used to be ransomware, but now it's ransomware in parallel with data theft, etc. So once they're in, they want to be able to find the crown jewels. They want to be able to find sensitive information. But to do that, you need a certain level of privilege. Yeah. So you need to make sure that one of the most important things that you're watching and having eyes on is all the authentication that's going on inside your environment. Once you've built up a picture of every single account that you have, their authentication patterns, when they authenticate, where they authenticate from, where they request authentication to. This is fundamental.
And that's all automated with tools, right? So
I mean, you can collect that. Anybody can collect that. I mean, you can go out and you can get something free to say, I want to ingest all of my AD logs, all of my Azure logs, all of my Okta, single sign-on, whatever I want to go. I want to collect it all. And that's fine. But you're talking about millions and millions and millions of those things happening every single day inside a very, not a large, an SME type organization, because it's a very, very noisy type of mechanism. It's happening all the time. But if you can use that information to understand patterns of behavior, to be able to identify, well, these types of accounts are, for example, service accounts. And service accounts, by their very nature, should behave in a very repetitive way every single day. That then makes it easy if you could implement some sort of AI to identify, well, why is a service account now trying to authenticate against a file server? Why is a service account now trying to get access to the internet. Service accounts don't ever get access to the internet. They fire up, they run an application, they may create a log file, etc. But
so there's a bank of little warning flags.
Absolutely, early warning.
Service accounts, and I guess anyone with a bit more privileged accounts.
Of course, admin accounts, any level of privilege.
And that's why we zero trust it, to try and get
that
down to a minimum.
If you can implement zero trust, I mean, that's the holy grail, isn't it? Really? But, but if you can't, then at least you should be able to implement some sort of behavioural monitoring of how these accounts typically behave. And that's the first step. That's always the first step. Once a zero-day vulnerability has been exploited, then inevitably there's going to be a call home to whoever's running the attack. So there's going to be an outbound communication at some point. So you want to be able to make sure that whilst you're tracking all these authentication attempts of where they're authenticating to and from, you want to also, in conjunction with that, look at any outbound activity, any sort of call homes to what we call C2 servers, which is command and control centers. We saw it with Exchange. Microsoft had a zero-day Exchange vulnerability, and the first thing they did is they created web shells that were then calling out to the internet.
Right.
And that's how they then, any sort of attacker can then make a decision about what they do next, because they want to be able to bypass any security controls that you have in place. And that then means dropping extra pieces of code, payloads, to then navigate past EDRs and whatever sort of security stack you've got in place. So there's a lot of reconnaissance early on to identify what the environment looks like, and then there's a call home, and then they start dropping more tools, more pieces of malware to then bypass what you've already got.
So to recap, what we're suggesting a CISO and the organisation should do is get visibility, check those authentication logs, get the behaviours, and then secondly as well, check for those call homes to some random C2 place.
So if I was going to implement something like this, what would I want to capture? I want to capture all of the authentication events, anything to do with data, because this is the end game. And if we haven't got eyes on data, then really the whole thing is a bit of a waste of time, because you could say, well, we've been exploited, we've been breached, and they compromised a service account and it gave them authentication to a data set, and we saw an outbound communication. But if we're not monitoring data, then really what do we have to show for it? We don't know what was taken, we don't know what was what was looked at, what was copied, what was encrypted, and what was sent out.
So the visibility that tools, I think Windows have them in-house, don't they? But Varonis gives that for all things, what the data was.
Absolutely. Well, it's key, yes. So you need to understand exactly what. So you need eyes on data. You need eyes on the authentication. You need eyes on the outbound communications. And then when you begin an investigation, you then are in this world of how do we prioritize?
I was about to say, because this is all very well, but if we don't know we don't have a playbook 3 a.m. in the morning and we've got an alert. They could have hours ahead of you.
They could. And how do you determine how much time and effort that you spend on looking at this? Well, one of the really important measures is being able to identify if data was taken, what data was looked at, but more importantly, what level of classification and sensitivity does that data have?
So how much do I care about?
How much do I care? How much IP is potentially being stolen from my company?
I see. That makes sense. So give me an example then for the Log4j or for PowerShell, whatever we're calling it. What did Varonis do with some clients?
So Log4j, just to, I'm sure everybody knows this now, Log4j is a logging module that is used in so many applications, internet-facing internal applications, by thousands of pieces of software out there. We use it within our platform as well. And a vulnerability was discovered that we've now called Log4Shell, that allowed attackers to basically just send any type of request for it to then conduct and then run activities on behalf of the attacker, whether it be reconnaissance in terms of reverse DNS lookups to find out where file servers are, whatever they're looking for, or dropping more malware, dropping ransomware, piggybacking onto other servers. So what did we do as a company? I think it's fair to say that we were very, very quick off the mark in terms of making sure that we had our platform patched.
Yeah.
And I know this firsthand because we've had many, many examples of customers saying it's been brilliant because you've been really proactive, you've been providing patches. We have a component within our platform called Live Update, which pretty much everybody turns on. It allows the platform to immediately download new updates. Mm-hmm. So these might be update patches to actually Log4j because there was a version that was released that then mitigated that 0-day vulnerability. Great. So we made sure that the components within our platform were running that and customers started updating it. So that was the sort of the reactive side of it, if you like.
And that's what CISO should be expecting from the vendors that they choose.
They should be. Yeah, they should be. But you've got to remember this is complicated stuff.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this is inbuilt within an application and a platform. So whilst you can sit there and expect vendors to do this, you know, there's going to be a window of opportunity for anyone that wants to go and exploit that. So you need to think, you know, how am I going to mitigate the potential risk of what has actually happened? So
there's the flip side. There's the reactive, you've done the patches quick, and then there's the proactive stuff, which is mitigating it. Yeah,
sure. And we helped with this as well, you know, because we looked at what Log4Shell allowed an attacker to do. Mm-hmm. We knew that there were outbound communications. Mm-hmm. So we actually created libraries to be able to look for certain terms and conditions that existed with inside log files. Oh. So when an attacker uses Log4Shell to then run a particular script or run a particular piece of reconnaissance, that is then written into a log file because of the very nature of what Log4j does. So we were able to actually go and investigate the log files to see if there had been a compromise, and we can see the certain types of commands are sitting in there. But we also looked at outbound communications as well. So we knew what were in the HTTP requests, the outbound communications. And so we actually created knowledge bases and sent them to everybody to say you can go and create these alerts that actually look for these strings inside, for example, proxy logs and also VPN logs as well, because it then gave them another backdoor to come back in.
That's really proactive. So it was basically like you discovered what the signature of that attack would be.
To some degree.
Or signatures. So that people
IOCs basically, You know, actually identify types of activity that resembles, you know, a compromised application, and then look at the outbound communication. So this is why it's funny, you know, whenever people think about who Varonis, they think about data.
Yeah.
And that is it, you know, everything about us is data. And then quite often we get, well, why do you want to monitor my proxy, my web activity? Why do you want to monitor my DNS? Why do you want to? Because all of that provides more context for us about what potentially has happened to your data. You know, what information has left your network, what type of reconnaissance was done to go and find file servers, how are people getting it? This is why a lot of our customers are now ingesting those sort of perimeter feeds into the platform, because you can actually identify potential what information was lost.
Yeah. Right.
So there was a really quick off the mark proactive response in terms of saying, here's a load of dictionaries, implement into your platform, let us scan the log files to see if you've been compromised. We also created a little tool, I forget its name now, I'll probably get crucified for this, but we created a little tool that actually helped you to go and identify compromised Log4j modules that sat inside other applications as well.
Oh, across everyone's estate?
Yeah, across everyone's estate as well. Well, I know the NCSC did something similar as well.
That would be really interesting for people, because I'm assuming they've dealt with Log4Shell by now, but you never know.
So.
Get in touch with Matt Block.
They're all on our website. We have blogs that explain it all as well when we can publicise.
And as a partner, we did that for people as well. So
sure.
we just, if the client was, needing some help with that blog, whatever, and we help come along in and do that.
Everyone needs help. Everyone needs help.
Yes.
It's a minefield out there, and who's to know what's going to happen next? So within the space of a couple of years, we've had SolarWinds, which was a supply chain attack where SolarWinds were compromised, and it was through an update. I think there were 18,000 companies infected overnight because they did the update, and it was signed, and that then allowed anybody to go and piggyback. We saw the Exchange 0-day vulnerability that happened, and that then gave an attacker basically system access to Exchange. And we saw Log4j. And I think the one common type of activity that we see across all of these is abnormal service account behavior.
Yeah.
Because every single one of these is an application that is run by a credential, a service account.
Yeah.
So we would see, for example, in Exchange, we saw abnormal service account behavior accessing mailboxes that were atypical to what it would typically do. And in the same way as SolarWinds, we would see abnormal service account behavior. So a service account that was associated with SolarWinds as a network monitoring solution, suddenly looking for data sources, suddenly jumping on different boxes. And the same for Log4j. So,
that's a common theme that is something to alert on now.
Yeah, and it's something that whenever we run an engagement with a customer or a prospect that are looking at it, we always say, if ever you see abnormal service account behavior, do not just
brush under the carpet.
It is so important. It's an early warning sign that there's an anomaly happening, and really at the end of the day, we want to identify anomalies before they become threats.
Yeah.
The SOC team don't want to receive alerts to say ransomware is underway.
No, that's too late.
They want to be told. But they'd much rather have an alert to say, it looks like this account's been compromised. Yeah. It's suddenly acting in a way that it's never behaved before. Oh, and by the way, this machine is actually typically owned by Anne.
Yeah.
And suddenly Anne's machine is being used by the backup service account to get access to. This is what.
And then we know what data it's trying to get access to or to send.
Of course. And so if you can correlate all that together, so think about the billions of events that we're capturing on a daily basis, you need something that's sitting there, understanding who is Anne, who is a service account, what data does Anne touch, what data does the service account touch, and when things go, awry.
Differently, yes.
Yeah, we want to be able to notify it. So service account behavior is probably the most important part of being able to identify any 0 day that's going to happen in the future.
Okie dokes. Well, that's a very clear message, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and we're saying this because we've seen it time and time again, and inevitably it will happen further down the line as well.
Yeah, because we're not superhumans. The things that people are writing will always have some sort of ability.
Absolutely.
Someone will find a way back in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's called using the lie of the land, the tools that are available to them. And if I can get a credential that has a certain level of privilege, I'm going to use it. And it's typically the way that our organisations get breached is through a vulnerability in an application, which if you can patch, great, but you typically can't patch it because we don't know about it, but that application will be running under a service.
Yeah. So I would like to leave people who might be listening. I mean, they've got a clear message there to what to monitor, but if you don't know, say you've set that up, what would be your next step? If you don't know what the 0 day vulnerability is there any kind of assessment that you could do?
Well, I mean, if you don't know what the 0 day vulnerability is, there's not a lot you can do, really, in terms of being able to ensure that you're in a good place other than collecting all the information that you need. But one of the things that you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Okay, so we don't want to wait until the horse is bolted and then start turning on the ability to learn understand behaviour.
No.
As with anything, if it's behaviour...
It needs a baseline, doesn't it?
Yeah, it needs a baseline, and we need a certain amount of time
to
learn what that behaviour is. I mean, this goes back to... I talk about this too often. I'm sure people are bored of hearing it. I proposed to my wife about 16 or 17 years ago in the south of France.
How nice.
And she said, yes, fortunately, but... I then went to buy her an engagement ring in a jeweller's in Cannes. We were in the south of France, and the bank wouldn't let me do it. It just point blank refused to let me pay for it. And I rang them up. They said, well, you don't normally buy engagement rings in the south of France.
So hopefully a once in a lifetime thing.
I never plan on doing it again. But it was, that's very rudimentary. But I mean, my wife paid for it in the end, and I paid it back, of course. But the point is that we've come on massively now.
Yes.
The more information that you give a platform, the more context, the more you feed into it, the more intelligent it becomes, and the quicker it gets to learn.
Yeah.
And so you do need a certain amount of time to understand the threshold of behaviour. I mean, one of the things that we look at, for example, is something called idle data. So there's the concept of stale data, and we know about rot. People look at that all the time. Stale data, in our eyes, is typically stale to an organization, whereas idle data is stale to an individual. So if I suddenly...
don't know if I understand that.
Well, let's say, for example, that your account, you have access to a set of data and it contains a lot of financial information.
Okay.
Because whatever, you have excessive permissions or something, but you never look at it.
So that's idle.
That's idle.
It's not stale, someone else uses it.
Someone else might be actively using it.
Yeah.
If I suddenly see Anne's account looking at idle and sensitive data, that's obviously a big warning sign.
Yeah.
Anne, I'm not suggesting you are, might be a bit disgruntled and fed up and want to leave, or your account's been compromised, or you've been, offered a big lump sum. We see this a lot now to go and do something. Then that to me is boom. Why is that happening? But of course, you need a certain amount of time to understand. Well, what is idle to Anne?
Yeah.
Or what is an idle to Anne?
And it's not something that you're going to archive all of the idle data because
because it's active to other people. You really should lock down the permissions.
So this is insider threats, right?
That is insider, but it's once anybody has compromised your network, they're an insider.
Yes.
Once they have an account that has credentials, they're an insider.
They're as good as an employee.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so you need to treat them all the same, which goes back to zero trust.
So I think the DRA, or the data risk assessment that Varonis does, and we do with you, the cyber resilience assessment, all of that sort of stuff, to use the company's own data to work out the vulnerabilities. None of this, no PowerPoint, in theory you could be doing this. It's really just actually...
Oh, it really is,
your real data.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's quite a good starter for tech.
Brilliant starter. And it goes back to this reactive and proactive view. So the proactive view is what we call the data risk assessment. This is your estate. This is where you have intellectual, regulatory, sensitive information. This is a level of overexposure. This is your level of staleness. This is, excessive permissions, etc. These are areas. This is your AD. This is the misconfigurations. These are the vulnerabilities. These are accounts that are administrative accounts that are running. So lots of different, proactive views. That's great. But then we also undertake what we call cyber resiliency assessments, which is that reactive side of it. Okay, so now we've got your environment, you've invested in this security stack, you have an incident response team. We then run an assumed compromised attack. We use a legitimate machine, a legitimate account, and we then start running exercises through stuff that we've written ourselves. This isn't anything you can download, but we go and look for data. We go and find it. We do reconnaissance. We talk to an outbound command and control center. We exfiltrate data.
And do you check that the SOC finds you?
Well, this is part of it. And then we even drop ransomware. And so there are three aspects as to why it's a sensible thing. First of all, it highlights where you have strengths and weaknesses in your current investments in security. It highlights, if you want to, you don't always need to do it, but you can highlight how well your response team are at identifying, picking up and prioritizing and doing what they can. And then the final bit of it really is for us to demonstrate that our behavioral models, our things that are identifying activity, pick up this stuff. Because you don't want to test that
in real life
when a zero-day vulnerability comes out. No. So this is why we do it. So we run these cyber resilience assessments.
Do you call that a red team, a purple team, or a...
Well, the red team is the exercise of actually doing it, of actually doing the attack. The blue team is on the other side of the fence where we're looking at the alert, and you can join them all together when you run a plan.
Okay, gotcha.
So purple team, so you argue though that it's purple team.
It's clear now.
But it's free. It's free. We don't charge anybody because we want people to have confidence that all of this clever behavioural stuff, which is a bit of a black art, is actually going to detect this stuff when it happens. And it's going to detect the early warning signs. These precursors to when, to suggest that actually this is part of a bigger thing and you are actually at risk of losing data at this point, unless you go and lock down what seems to be compromised at the moment. So
brilliant. So thank you very much. We need to be proactive, get DRA, reactive, get cyber resilience, and just get those early warning signs in.
And collect all the right logs, and then you're some way.
Sounds simple.
And even if you then do all of this stuff and you're still compromised and you still get data stolen, then at least you're in a situation where the auditors came knocking, or the board start asking, or the ICO tell you what happened, you can demonstrate all of these steps that you put in place to mitigate it, and to the best of my ability, I did everything I can to try and stop it. And there, lies where we all want to be.
Yeah.
And I think generally we accept we did it.
Yeah.
But you need to be able to demonstrate that you actually put these things in place. I wouldn't want to use.
No. Well, good luck to them. It's also like the most core, I think, growing area for most people. So there are other reasons to be a CISO.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'm very fascinated. Never sit still.
No, exactly. If you like excitement.
Yeah, but there are pros and cons to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much, Matt.
No problem, Matt.